Webster, welcome back to INN. It's been too long.
Thank you so much. We tried to have one appearance every month around the middle of the month. I was perfectly happy with that. That was a good deal.
Sir, you know what? I'm going to set that in stone. You just said it on the air. You tell me, you want the Tuesday in the middle of the month or the Thursday in the middle of the month? What do you prefer?
I guess Tuesday is probably better.
I am going to email you the exact details for the next year, which Tuesday it is. That's the middle of the month, and you're locked in. It helps me. I don't have to call you to get you on. Anyway, Webster, thanks so much. We had a wonderful time with you here in New York. You gave a great talk at the Left Forum. I already talked about that. Our little coterie of people here in New York, you're so informative. We learned.
We have a growing chapter, growing local of the United Front Against Austerity, and its election arm, which is the Tax Wall Street Party, which is growing. And at that event where you spoke on the same program there, and Joe Calhoun, we were at the Left Forum. With our 60-plus people there, we were well above the average. As a matter of fact, we were sort of in the middle between the foundation-funded poobahs at the top, right, the Amy Goodmans that everybody knows about, and then the average sort of rather nondescript left, sometimes meritorious, but often not, that were sort of, you could see them limping along with 10
a little outdated, most of them. Yeah.
The whole thing is outdated. Well, the institution goes back, the first one I remember going to was at Hofstra University on Long Island in 1969, in the middle of the Vietnam War. And the guy, Stanley Aronowitz, who's now a professor of sociology, was the honcho then and is now. But the main thing is Amy Goodman. And as broadcasters, right, anybody who has an internet radio program, like you, like me, you can get World Crisis Radio from me. That's on tarpley.net. Once a week on Genesis Communications Network. You can get it from there.
Power-packed with information.
What we're trying to do is compete with Amy Goodman. We're trying to deprive Amy Goodman of this monopoly that she has on the left-directed or progressive or even just intelligent, well-informed analysis of the world. Because the one big thing you have to ask in this area is, are you the agent of a political party or a candidate? That might disqualify some libertarians and some New Agers, for that matter. And then on the left is, are you foundation funded? Are you getting money from the Ford Foundation or institutions of this type? Which, of course, under President Reagan's Executive Order 12333, that's really the privatized CIA. The CIA or FBI or domestic counterinsurgency of the 50s, 60s, and 70s was then privatized by Reagan into foundations, front companies, and other institutions under 12333. So
Webster, I want to dive in just for 1 second, and I do this very cautiously because you have great things to say, but you were there when I was talking, and I tried to address this issue too. I'd love to get your take on it, which is, okay, just as you said, certainly the Ford Foundation happily acting as a front for CIA money laundering and distribution to, various so-called, groups that would be leftist or against the administration. That's been going on for a long time. However, I posed the question, it's official now. The two professors at Princeton put out a paper. The United States absolutely is an oligarchy right now. So then my question to the audience, and you chimed in on it, the Ford Foundation, named after Henry Ford. Was Henry Ford an oligarch? If we are in an oligarchy right now, and Henry Ford was an oligarch, what does that say if a lot of our brethren on the left are receiving money from foundations named after oligarchs?
Well, of course, let's just look at it. It's too complicated to do the whole life of Henry Ford. If you want to know the life of Henry Ford in an accessible form, very readable, I would urge you to look at a book called The Flivver King. Flivver is Flivver. It's the old word for an automobile, a car. And this is by Upton Sinclair. And we know Upton Sinclair was a muckraker, political activist, ran for governor of California on the Epic ticket. He was the third party. End poverty in California. And, this had, I think, an important long-term impact as well as whatever it was in the short term. We can say that Henry Ford shared the fate of many industrialists in Europe and the U.S., and that he evolved rather rapidly towards fascism after World War I under the impact of the Bolshevik Revolution, Mussolini's March on Rome, Hitler's seizure of power, the union-busting tactics pioneered by Mussolini and Hitler. And we have to remember that is the essential feature of fascism. It is to destroy working-class organizations and then systematically drive down real wages. You see all this in this Flipper King. So much so that Henry Ford had a kind of a personal fascist army, which were the goons, right? The enforcers at his plants, and some of the leaders of that group became just justifiably infamous. But you can remember in a march, Henry Ford's problem was that he could not control the city of Detroit, but he could control Dearborn. So the entire Dearborn apparatus was in his pocket, mayor, police, and so forth. So when the workers had a protest march, as long as they were in Detroit, it was more or less okay. But as soon as they crossed the line into Dearborn, Henry Ford had set up machine guns. People were killed, right? The Battle of Deputies Run and so forth. And therefore, you look at people like Walter Reuther and the other leaders of the United Auto Workers, that is a stirring chapter of mass struggle. I know right-wingers just can't understand this, right? They just don't get it. But the course of human progress, the building of a middle class, things you take for granted, right? An 8-hour day, a 5-day
things we used
week.
to take for granted.
Well, I think you ought to take them for granted today. In other words, those are your economic rights, and don't let Ron Paul or Rand Paul tell you don't have them. So the idea is no market ever delivered those benefits. You didn't get an 8-hour day or a 5-day week or a minimum wage. Child labor laws. Let's look at that. We have this guy Mike Lee, right, the Mormon senator from Utah. He says child labor laws are unconstitutional, right? So what does he want to go back to? Dickens? Are we going to start sending children down into mines to pull carts full of coal?
Maybe he has too many children. Maybe he has got several wives and lots of progeny, and he wants to put them to work. I don't know. But is this an echo? What you're talking about?
Fundamentalist LDS.
Yeah. Listen,
anyway,
I'm asking you a question here. What you're saying about Henry Ford, is this an echo of Andrew Carnegie and the Pinkertons even before that?
There is this problem, right? This is always going to be the problem of class struggle in society. And by the way, there is class struggle in Plato's sense. There's always Plato or Machiavelli. You can read Plato's Republic, and he talks about the problem of a ruling class. And the point of that being that if it's an oligarchy, it is a class that rules and not individuals. So whenever you have power massed together like that with the motive of greed and aggrandizement, you're going to need some powerful countervailing forces, right? The balance of power in society is just as important as it is on the international stage. So one way is to have a government that responds favorably to mass concerns rather than big money concerns, and certainly we do not have that at the present time. But things could get worse. And if you look at Mike Lee saying that child labor regulations are unconstitutional, you look at Ron Paul telling you do not have a right to health care because that belongs to somebody else. Or Little Rand. Little Rand has now flipped on drones. He's now in favor of drones. Did you catch that?
I'm not surprised, but all of it, healthcare.
It's a big deal now. We got to do justice to that.
Well, we can, but you know what? The music means we're going on break, Dr. Tarpley.
Okay.
So please hold on.
Okay.
Webster Griffin Tarpley, friends, in the house, tarpley.net. All right, if you go there, you get it all. Webster's weekly radio program, which is very, very powerful. You'll hear this radio program and all the other appearances Dr. Tarpley has made on INN World Report. If you go to tarpley.net, as well as his many fascinating writings, we're going to be back with Dr. Tarpley right after this top of the hour break. Hey, good friends, usually I let the music play. Not tonight, not with the guests like Webster Griffin Tarpley, who's on the line. We're going to get right back to it. Webster Tarpley on the line, tarpley.net. If you haven't gone there yet, why? It's power-packed, great information. Go there, take a look. Maybe I'm totally out to lunch, and then you don't have to go there anymore. But I think you'll find there's lots of good information there. His weekly radio shows are there. Every appearance he's ever made on INN World Report Radio is there if you ever missed any of them, and lots of other good information as well. Now then,
Tom,
Dr. Tarpley, two things. First of all, all this high-flying theoretical talk is great. Can we get down to specifics? Can we talk about some people who are actually committing themselves, running for Senate?
We're talking about is just to complete this other point, right? The people in the U.S. ruling class, large industrialists, bankers, and others, virtually all of them were pro-fascist between the two world wars, in the sense of supporting Mussolini, advocating Mussolini's union-busting methods. And I would say a good third to a half of them were also strongly pro-Hitler. And the people who have funded the libertarian movement were, during that interwar period, were in this fascist to Nazi camp, because this was their means of approaching organized labor in the midst of an organized labor upsurge. So what you see, the Ford Foundation represents a widespread recognition in the U.S. ruling class that after World War II, after the defeat of Hitler, they had lost their reference point in the world. They had to change their counterinsurgency methods. So they did a reversal of the ideological fields in many cases. And from being right-wing goon squads, they flipped and became left-wing social engineering, sociology-guided counterinsurgency foundations. And the Ford Foundation is, of course, one of them. But we also note the Koch brothers helping to create the Cato Institute, what is called libertarianism today. In other words, the world of the Baltards and the rest of it. That comes out of the Cato Institute, originally funded by the father of the Koch brothers, who was an ardent admirer of Mussolini and of Italian fascism. So you can see how this evolution goes. So that's the answer.
You're talking about the Frankfurt School, the Fabian Socialists, sort of the left side of the oligarchy, no?
Well, those, of course, are they contribute, right? They're a large part of the sort of postmodernist doctrine. And you could see at this left forum, right, there were still some residues, right? Herbert Marcuse in 1968 was chosen by these people to be the philosopher of wrecking the anti-war student movement upsurge of 67 to 68. We have such people today. There's this guy called Zizic from somewhere, I guess, Serbia, in the former Yugoslavia. There are purveyors of Frankfurt School doctrine still around today. And some of them are clowns. I think Zizic would probably qualify as a clown, but they're there. And they have sort of merged with the French psychoanalytic school of Lacan, Foucault, and other sort of structuralist neo-Freudians. So you get this kind of a toxic soup of charlatans and wordmongers and kind of
all being paid by foundations or whatnot, to write and talk.
Yeah, exactly.
Listen, let me ask you a serious question here. You raised a very fascinating point. Yes, Henry Ford. There was a book we reviewed years ago when it first came out here on INN. Henry Ford and the Jews. Adolf Hitler kept books of Henry Ford's in his waiting room to give out to people for free. From his Lansing, Michigan op-eds and so forth. But let me ask you something. Yes, a lot of the American plutocrats, eugenicists and so forth, they loved Wall Streeters. They loved Adolf Hitler and Mussolini, as you aptly point out. But tell me, they loved him against, of all things, not just labor unions and all, but Soviet communism. Wasn't Soviet communism the product of the British. And is this a divergence? How do you balance these two things out? The British loved wrecking Russia with the commies, and the Americans loved wrecking the commies with the fascists.
You have to note, first of all, the coming of Lenin to St. Petersburg, right, to Leningrad in 1918 is accomplished by the German General Staff, and I would point to two people there. Field Marshal von Hindenburg and General Ludendorff were the ones who adopted a policy of fomenting revolution, any kind, in the areas east and south of Germany. And the important reason to name those two is that they are also the founding fathers of Ukraine. Ukraine being created in early 1918, and Lenin had already been there since 1917. But in early 1918, the nation of Ukraine was internationally recognized for the first time by Austria-Hungary and by Germany and by the Ottoman Empire, and I think also by Bulgaria. And that was the Central Powers. In other words, that was the German-led coalition. And
sounds very reminiscent of every time there's a coup in Venezuela, the United States jumps forward and recognizes the new government.
That's all well known. This is not well known. In other words, most people do not know that the founding fathers of Ukraine were Ludendorff and Hindenburg. And the reason they did it, what they wanted out of the deal was 1 million tons of grain, 400 million eggs, 50,000 tons of beef, manganese, linseed oil, and on and on and on. So Ukraine is an artificial state. It is not a real historical nation. It never appeared on the map as any kind of independent country or even a political subdivision until 1918. So they brought Lenin in. Then we have a phase where the British, there's a very turbulent phase where you have white armies, a lot of them based in Ukraine, right? The Denikin, Wrangel, Kolchak, Kornilov.
The Czechs went in there too, right?
Sorry?
The Czechoslovakians went in there too.
Yes, there's a whole story with that. Right? I'm trying to keep it bare bones, though, because if you want to get detailed, we'll never finish.
Go ahead.
So the point of this being is that Ukraine was the nest of all of these white armies on the lower Don, right? So this is what we're seeing right now, right? The Donets and so forth. However, here's the big difference. When fascism or Nazism took over a country, the ruling class was not disturbed. And the ruling class means bankers, nobility, oligarchs, big industrialists, rich people who control money production.
In Italy? The king in Italy?
The king remained, right? And yes. the entire ruling class was undisturbed. Similarly, in Germany, even with Hitler, as long as you didn't scheme against the Nazi party and try to interfere with Hitler's rule, you were left, everything was left intact, because by that time there was no more monarchy in Germany. The difference, though, is when the communists come to town, they quite often exterminate these parasitical, oligarchical ruling classes, right? A monarchy would not tend to survive very long under communist rule, right? Not any length of time.
Not in Russia, not in China, not in Tibet, not anywhere, right?
Well, Bulgaria, Yugoslavia, Romania, these are all monarchies, right? So, and then they come to an end. So this is the point. And this is a very important difference. And the other difference is, you can say, when Germany gets through with Hitler in 1945, the place is a ruin. It's a rubble field. The difference is that in the Soviet case, right, with the 5-year plans, Stalin and company managed to modernize the country in an unprecedented way, so that they come out of it with a full-set modern economy, with modern steel, modern chemicals, modern electricity generation,
modern education,
middle class. Hello?
Yeah, I said modern education. That stuff had to happen because dumb people got a chance to go to school. I know lots of Russians who were educated in that system.
Yeah, and that's one of the hallmarks of communism, is that even secondary education becomes accessible to the sons and daughters of workers, which it certainly was not before. So it is not the case that Hitler and Stalin are on the same level. And if you're Franklin D. Roosevelt and you come along and you've got to choose with whom are you going to ally, there's another very important consideration, is that Hitler was on a mad rush to expand. In other words, it's one aggression after another, right? Never ending, right, until he stopped. Precisely because he has no natural resource base. He's got no oil. He's got any number of other things that he simply lacks. He doesn't have the nickel of Petsamo there in northern Scandinavia. Whereas with Stalin, you're dealing with a country that has a broad, secure natural resource base, so they can afford to take the long view, and they do. But now we got to move along. Can I just propose that we leave Europe and come back home? I'd actually go to Nebraska.
Tarpley, Webster, if it's home, if it's Europe, if it's down the street here in Brooklyn, whatever, it's going to be interesting, your perspective. Okay. And that's not a sycophant talking, friends. I'll hit him hard if I think he's off base. But please, go ahead. Go. And I'll do that, don't you, Webster?
Look, I want people to think back and look at it as a bit of a detective story. The U.S. ruling class habitually grooms a favorite candidate each 4-year cycle, or perhaps I should say candidates, because the favorites that they have are generally paired with a spare candidate. It comes along. So they have a candidate that represents the Wall Street combination, but they vary the geographical, ideological, personal. They do color, they do gender, they do national origin, they do all sorts of things. The one very well documented case is Jimmy Carter. If you get my book, Obama: The Postmodern Coup, I do a whole comparison of Carter and Obama as parallel lives, right? But the trick is this. We have Zbigniew Brzezinski, David Rockefeller's appointed manager of the Trilateral Commission, who tells us that when it was clear about 1975 or 76, it was very likely that the Republicans would be voted out because of Vietnam, Watergate, because of Ford's pardoning Nixon, the wave of revulsion, which you could see then in the 1974 congressional elections, right, when the Republicans fell like 10 pins. The ruling elite could see that it would not be possible to govern through a Republican puppet president. So therefore they thought of a Democratic puppet president, and they wanted to get somebody very far away from Washington, and they wanted to get somebody, they thought, from the South, a Southern governor, because that was a field which they had not cultivated for all the time, really, since the Civil War. You'd had Democratic presidents.
It's kind of like Nixon goes to China, right? You got to get somebody from the belly of the beast. I'm Jimmy Carter. You know what else they decided at that very same time, I think, Webster, that was crucial? They also ended the draft. And I think that was...
We're trying to focus on the power question because I want to get you to Nebraska, okay?
Yeah. We're going to go to Nebraska when we come back from the break, friends. But I submit to you, Webster, that concentrating power, ending the draft had a lot to do with that. Good friends, welcome back. Somebody just emailed me asking who performed this song. It's a group named Brad. It's a great song, Needle and Thread. And that's what we're all going through this country. We're hanging by a needle and thread. But let's go back to our guest, Dr. Webster Griffin Tarpley. Dr. Tarpley, it's all great. I think this historical perspective on right, left, phony baloney, they put the characters in that they want is great. Please wrap that up and let's go to Nebraska.
No, but listen, the point of this is I'm trying to show people that there is this well-established pattern of the ruling class grooming people who come out of unexpected quadrants, right? They come out of nowhere, as people said with Carter, and nevertheless, they are the chosen vehicle of Wall Street. And just a couple of other peculiarities, if I could just develop this idea. With Carter, he obviously filled the bill as a Southern governor, as Brzezinski wrote, right? He was somebody who was interested in the Trilateral Commission. He was a Southern governor. Another important thing about them is they want people who are mentally damaged. Carter had been through nervous breakdowns. He disguised this as a born-again Christian experience, but he was somebody with a great deal of mental instability. He was paired with a spare Carter, who was Governor Reuben Askew of Florida, which this is a guy that Brzezinski also writes about. So that's how they did that one. Then, of course, by the time of the late Bush administration, because of the world economic depression based on derivatives, which Bush had helped to unleash, because of the hatred in large parts of the population because of the Afghan and Iraq war, it was clear the Republicans were a very bad bet for 2008. So in this case, what I've shown, and these are my books, Obama, the Postmodern Coup, and Barack H. Obama, the Unauthorized Biography. These groups around Zbigniew Brzezinski and Samuel Huntington had prepared Obama as a surprise candidate, right? The first black president, and that gave them, a great deal of, demagogic potential. Obama was paired with Deval Patrick, the governor of Massachusetts. In other words, if Obama had overdosed or God knows what, gotten arrested, they could have fallen back on Deval Patrick. So the idea is a very highly educated, preppy, Ivy League black guy, but post-racial. In other words, not a warm race monger in the sense you might say Al Sharpton or somebody like this is, right?
And I'm going to jump in just in time to introduce U.S. AFRICOM. Go ahead.
Yes, but that's after he gets elected. We're trying to focus on how do they get these people in, because that's the first problem. Then, of course, their design, yes, that with Obama, and I wrote this, right? This is all over that book, Obama, the Postmodern Coup, that he's going to be the guy who leads the fight of the U.S. to kick the Chinese out of Africa, right? And that's the goal, against the Chinese, to reassert U.S. imperialism. Now, in the case of Obama, I flatter myself that I discovered this pretty much before anybody else that I'm aware of, right? Maybe I'm the first person in the world. In other words, the first person who was not a part of this plan who realized that this was the new Carter, a new and highly organized push by the Trilateral Commission and similar Wall Street banking groups to install such a puppet president. But I didn't understand this guy because the 9/11 Truth Movement and the question of the rogue B-52 and the Kenny Bunkport warning, which I authored, essentially predicting the attempt to bomb Syria with a B-52 about a week before it happened, and people can go back and look at that. I was not thinking about the presidency so much. I was thinking about staving off this repeated war danger from Cheney in particular. So that it took me until January 2008, between the Iowa caucus and the New Hampshire primary, to begin putting out these alarm signals. It's Obama, the Manchurian candidate for 2008. So that was 9 months before the election, 10 months before the election, 11 months maybe. But now, here's the news. I believe I have identified at least one and perhaps two of the Manchurian candidates groomed by Wall Street and the intelligence community and the ruling class in general for 2016. And now this is 2.5 years in advance of the actual vote. And I would direct your attention, therefore, to Ben Sasse, S-A-S-S-E. Ben Sasse, currently the Republican candidate for the Senate, United States Senate from Nebraska. I believe this is the primary Manchurian candidate option. However, as I've tried to argue, Carter, Askew, Obama, Deval Patrick, who's the spare? I think the spare is Tom Cotton of Arkansas. And I base this on an interesting profile, the kind of a Plutarch's Parallel Lives in the New York Times, which points out Sasse and Cotton both loaded with Ivy League degrees, elitist credentials, government experience, nevertheless parading themselves as local yokels, right? As good old boys, as country folk, right? Regular guys, whatever we want to call them, from these rural farming areas, right? Nebraska and or Arkansas. We haven't done
what party affiliation do these two people have?
They're Republicans. So
both of them. So they're counting on a swing now. We had enough of the Democrats. It's time for people to forget about the Republicans, and so therefore go back to them.
You've also got to realize that the ruling class circles that groom such characters, there's not only one center that does this. In other words, it may be that the fragmentation of the U.S. ruling class has now reached the point where rival Manchurian candidates may appear. So far, I don't see them, but this is a little bit hard to figure out.
On the left side, everyone's talking about Elizabeth Warren. Do you see her as a potential Manchurian candidate?
No, I don't think she'd be Manchurian at all, and I think that's absolutely why. In other words, I'm not saying that I support her at all at this point. I would probably welcome her candidacy to provide an alternative to this monstrosity of Hillary Clinton, right? Hillary Clinton, the maximum of complacency, a warmonger, a tool
Manchurian-ness?
Certainly, except that she's too well known. In other words, she's the opposite of a Manchurian candidate in the way that I'm trying to use it, because she's the obvious, right? The coronation, not even an election.
She's a post-Manchurian candidate. She was Manchurian a long time ago, but now it's not necessary.
The ruling class wants to surprise you. They've got to surprise you in your ideological defenses. And if you've been spending 8 years hating Obama, they want to offer you something that looks completely different. If you hated Nixon, here's Carter. If you hated Bush the younger, Mad Dog Bush 43, then here we have Obama. Get the idea? But they're duping you every time. Now let's
Papa Bush. Here's Bill Clinton.
Yeah, but again, this is less Manchurian. In other words, this is less predictable, because there was no such presumption that Bush the elder would be voted out. That emerged really as the economy deteriorated with unprecedented rapidity.
There was a presumption after his attack on Iraq, but then it changed. But Bill Clinton came from nowhere.
That he would win, but the economy dragged him down. But that was not predictable. As a matter of fact, I remember writing my biography of Bush the elder, right? George H.W. Bush, the unauthorized biography. When I started writing that in early 2001, in early 1991. What am I saying? The problem was I thought, this is a kamikaze mission. In other words, this guy's going to get reelected, but I've got to stand up against him because he's a scoundrel. And then month after month after month, his poll numbers plummeted as the economy collapsed, because he was, of course, an absolute Wall Street devotee. So it's got to be a situation where there's a very strong presumption that one party is going to be out, and therefore it's going to be the other party. So this involves large investments, right? You got to commit a hell of a lot of money. That's why you need a spare. But you got to be sure that it's going to be a Republican or a Democrat or something like this. And you might say, well, today it's not sure at all that it would be a Republican. As a matter of fact, probably not a Republican. But these charming individuals that we're dealing with, they may have various operations that we don't know about that they're going to use to try to demolish the Democratic Party. And as you know, my position is the Republican Party needs to be destroyed, at which point the Democratic Party would split into a Wall Street wing, the majority, with Obama and Harry Reid and Schumer and Durbin and the rest of them, and then an anti-Wall Street or pro-labor or populist wing. That would include Elizabeth Warren, Marcy Kaptur.
Well, look, the music means we've got to take a break, but, I would submit to you that the first thing that has to happen is the Democrats have to get out of the way if the Republicans are in a circular fight. For a small slice of your oil wells, we'll send our boys in with their gun shells. Great song from England, their Fairport Convention. All right, back to Dr. Tarpley. Webster, if you could get us out to some specific candidates. I know you're talking about Nebraska and so forth.
Let's talk about Nebraska. Let me just finish up on Ben Sasse. Now,
please do.
There's just some idea of who this guy is. In his life, his resume, he tells us that he was at one time the interface of the CIA, the FBI, and the Department of Justice, and that he was involved in intelligence sharing in the U.S. intelligence community. Now, this is not a farmer, right? This is not a good old boy. This is a spook. He's up there with Hayden, I'm sure, and Clapper and all the rest of these characters, right? So watch out. He then moved over to Health and Human Services, where he worked with Mike Leavitt, the Mormon former governor of Utah, who was the resident Malthusian for George Bush the Younger at Health and Human Services. But what we're interested in is we've got to go back. There are a couple of skeletons lurking for Sasse. Actually, let me just get right to the point. There was a profile of Sasse in the New York Times. A woman wrote in and said, I have known Ben Sasse since high school, and he has habitually introduced himself in social situations with, "Hi, I'm Ben Sasse. I'm the 45th president of the United States, elected as a Republican after having studied at Yale." And he was saying this between 20 and 25 years ago. So this would assume that somebody had counted this out, right? Somebody had done the arithmetic with a pretty good sense of what was coming. In other words, a high-level ruling class character had told him this. So the 45th president. And then the same woman writing into the New York Times says, I had a girlfriend who went to Harvard, and when she got to Harvard, she found that there was a guy on campus introducing himself as Ben Sasse, the 45th president of the United States. So if this is true, but it's really only one source, but it implies that there might be two sources. If these ladies are listening in, I'd love to talk to them. So this is the idea. Now, what could be the problem? Ben Sasse attended St. John's of Annapolis. This is a liberal arts college here in Annapolis, Maryland, but it's of a special kind. It's the neocon liberal arts college. And you'll remember Leo Strauss, the theoretician of neocon fascism, was professor. After the University of Chicago, he then moved on to St. John's of Annapolis. So we're told that Ben Sasse got an MA, Master of Arts, from St. John's of Annapolis in 1998, and that in the years leading up to that, while Sasse was studying for his MA at St. John's, he served in a very important and sensitive role. At that time, we still had the Republican and Democratic House groups had pages. The House of Representatives would invite high school kids to work for a year or 6 months or whatever it was as errand boys, errand girls, assistants for the House of Representatives. And this would have been 1996, 1997, 1998, right? MA usually one or two years. Now, you may remember in 2006, for many people, many Republicans especially, one of the reasons the Republicans lost the control of the Congress in 2006 was a guy called Mark Foley. Remember him? Congressman from Florida. And his specialty was molesting these pages who were legally children. They're under 21. They're teeny boppers, right? But they're away from their parents, and they live in dormitories on Capitol Hill and do their work. And then they also have a school because they've got to continue their schooling and their education. This goes on too. So there were four proctors. A proctor was somebody charged with watching over the students, not just academically, but in terms of behavior, safety, not being away at night, all the rest of the stuff. So of the four proctors, these guys were also tutors. They would help with academic subjects and schoolwork. Ben Sasse was one. So So here's the problem. If we're talking about approximately 96, 97, 98, or thereabouts, these are the years when Mark Foley of Florida had just arrived at the Congress and had begun to molest these children. And he was joined by another Republican colleague, Jim Kolbe, Kolbe, who took, you may remember this story, took some of these kids on a boating jaunt down the Colorado River, I guess the Grand Canyon. And during that, he made all kinds of improper advances and tried to molest these kids. So the first question that has to be asked and answered is, Ben Sasse, when you were one of the four proctors supposedly taking care of the kids, the high school kids, in the House Page program, what did you do? Where were you when Mark Foley was notoriously molesting these kids? And although Foley was only kicked out in 2006, he had arrived there in 1995 and had, according to published accounts that we can cite, had begun molesting the kids. If you want to look at some
under Sasse's watch.
On his watch, absolutely.
Sasse watch.
Wayne Madsen. For people who know Wayne Madsen has an initial article about this, and I know he's interested because I think he sees also this potential for the Manchurian candidate. So is Sasse a part of this activity, or is he a front man protecting it? What is he?
Well, I think another question, serious question, is he compromised because he may have been neither, but he was either responsible or, he should have been knowledgeable. So that means that, they got him.
If you call yourself an evangelical Christian out there in Nebraska, is this who you want to represent you? Now, here's the other thing. It gets the plot thickens. More recently, Sasse was the president of a small university in Nebraska. It's called Midland University. And if you look up Midland University, athletic director, you'll see that the top coach, right, the athletic director of this small university, small school out there, has just been arrested, right, thrown in jail for sexual crimes involving prostituting students and other panky of all sorts. We don't need to go into the details. So here we have, on Sasse's watch, pages were molested by Foley, by Kolbe, and presumably also by others, because that was a caucus those guys had going. And just in the last couple of years, right, at Midland University, Sasse shows up as president. On his watch, students were subjected to sexual abuse, prostitution went on, and other things, and the athletic director had to be arrested and thrown in jail. Now, is that
and Dr. Tarpley, I got you on all that, but I just want to add, I tried to throw it in before. Yes, on its face, if the man either was part of this or should have known, that's bad. But isn't there another dimension in that maybe his culpability is being overlooked and therefore he's being blackmailed? So he's the ideal candidate because if he ever gets out of line, bada boom.
Well, this of course is fairly standard, right? We're talking about Nebraska. So as soon as we're talking about Nebraska, those of us with a certain historical memory will realize that at about, let's say, 1990 or thereabouts, say 25 years ago, Nebraska or Omaha was a headline that meant pedophiles, and it meant the abuse of children. This is the so-called Larry King Franklin Savings and Loan scandal of Republican plutocrats in the state of Nebraska. And you have to assume that some of those tendencies were never rooted out, so they're perhaps still there. The general idea there was, if you were an aspiring politician, you had to. You really were not acceptable unless you were willing to be photographed in flagrante delicto, as they used to say, in the midst of these illegal activities, so that your owners could always destroy you. In other words, they would always have a mechanism of control. They could say, oh, you vote against what I want? I'll destroy your career within 24 hours. So that is fairly standard, right? And that That's
all this homoerotic stuff that's rumored, all these skull and bones and stuff, that there's part of the initiation. Right. They got that on you in case you ever, you could rise, but, if you ever get out of line, wham. We'll be right back after this. All right, good friends, welcome back. Tom Colley, INN World Report. We're coming down the home stretch with Dr. Webster Tarpley. Dr. Tarpley's been laying out, I think, very in great detail, the false choices that we're presented with, the back and forth, the oligarchy having candidate after candidate and backup candidate after backup candidate. And Dr. Tarpley, you're laying out, it looks like the swing, all right, we've had two Democratic administrations, one after the other. It's time maybe to go back toward the Republicans. Maybe everybody forgot about how bad it hurts when they're in charge. And you talked about these two candidates that they've already got lined up.
Yes, and I would also add, from my point of view, it's important that there never be a Republican president ever again, because if you get a Republican president, you will have war. It should be clear to everybody. If Romney had been president, you would have had war with Syria last September. You might have had war with Iran at any number of points, and you'd probably have war with Russia, given the fact that Romney was, of course, governed by the White Horse prophecy of the Mormons, like Joseph Smith, which points to an apocalyptic Armageddon with Russia at the end of that. But the other thing, of course, if you had the Republicans in, they would then pack the Supreme Court with fascist judges. And at that point, you can essentially abolish the franchise, which is what Republicans are doing. Everybody knows that Republicans are attempting to prevent blacks, Hispanics, old, young, poor from voting, right, using these subterfuges, right, that they have. The other thing is, I would point to Michigan. We've had people like Reverend Edward Pinkney arrested for gathering signatures to eject the Mayor Hightower, who was an agent of Whirlpool Corporation, Wall Street controlled, and then the attempt to throw Congressman Conyers off the ballot, which I think has failed. I hope it's failed. I'm going to be checking that in time for my own program tomorrow. So if you get any Republican president, they will attempt to start wars, to deprive people of their voting rights, and create a permanent austerity dictatorship for which the Republican Party is an adequate vehicle. The Democratic Party, much less so, much harder to do a real dictatorship with the Democrat, right? Whatever people think. Now, fortunately, you don't have to sit back and watch Sasse ride into the Senate, right? He would get to the Senate at the beginning of 2015 if he wins, and then he'd already declare his candidacy within a year, 6 months or so, in the same way Obama did. He learned from Obama. Don't stay in the Senate. You have to make votes. As soon as you make votes, you have a record. Then you've turned some people off, and then you become weaker and weaker the more votes you take. So, fortunately, there is the tax Wall Street party. So there should never be a Republican. It doesn't mean there should be a Democrat. Somebody should come forward with an alternative to this. We're trying to do it. It's called the Tax Wall Street Party. It works together with the United Front Against Austerity. And there in Nebraska, you're going to have Dan Burdorf, Burdorf, a fifth-generation Nebraskan, and you can find him at danfornebraska.com, I believe, danfornebraska.com. He is currently gathering signatures to be on the ballot. If you're anywhere near Nebraska, get in touch. You can contact me through tarpley.net. Go to the Speakers Bureau contact feature. Send me an email. I'll forward it on to the people in Nebraska. Dan operates out of Lincoln, but we're obviously all over the state. Now, here's the idea: you don't like Wall Street? Well, attack Wall Street. If you're smart enough to figure out that Wall Street is your main enemy and that government is merely the battlefield where you confront Wall Street, if you're smart enough to do that, then you've got to attack Wall Street. Wall Street is the main enemy, and therefore, the Wall Street sales tax, the 1% tax on all transactions, right? As you've said, Tom, if you buy a pair of shoes, you're going to pay between 7 and 12% state sales tax, depending on the state.
8.25 here in New York City.
Okay, when you it's up to it's higher. I think it's almost 12% in California. But the idea being that when if I have flash trading, there's this influential book, Flash Boys. The Flash Boys can do 1 million trades per second of flash trading, and they pay absolutely zero sales tax.
May I say something to get your comment, Webster, on that point?
Yeah.
Okay. Isn't it the standard BS that the reason against this is because it'll be bad for business, it'll hurt the economy? How much more hurt can we sustain in the economy? Okay. When is the economy? They've gotten everything they've asked for. They've gotten everything they wanted. They've gotten carte blanche. They've lowered the tax rates, everything else. What are they talking about?
Well, the argument against it, which might have been valid, 30 or 40 years ago, although I don't even think so. Lord Keynes, in Lord Keynes, I think in the General Theory in the 1930s, says you should have a tax on financial transactions, financial turnover. The argument is that those are capital markets, so you don't want to hobble or interfere with the capital market. But it's not a capital market. If you're doing flash trades at 1 million transactions per second, that's a gambling den. It's not a capital market. It's pure speculation. Has nothing to do with capitalizing.
It's point shaving, right? It's making a profit off of point shaving.
Nebraska. Dan Berghoff, Dan for Nebraska. We wanted to come out also for the idea of seizing the Fed, or as you put it, deprivatizing the Fed, nationalizing the Fed, that the needs of the country have to be served, right? The Federal Reserve, under this stupid woman Yellen, is that she is the servant of the bankers rather than being the servant of full employment, rising standards of living, the growth of the U.S. economy, competition with foreign states like China and so forth that we need to think about. So, and then, especially for the farm sector, parity agriculture. In other words, restore 100% of parity under the Agricultural Adjustment Act from the 1930s, so that a farmer is guaranteed a base price which is sufficient to cover the cost of production, a reasonable profit, the living of the farmer and his family, or her family, and then the idea that there's got to be capital investment in the farm, right? In equipment or irrigation or fertilizer or other things. So that's Dan Berghoff, and I urge people to support him. And I just mentioned now in conclusion in New York State, you've got Randy Credico. He's a colorful character, right? He's unpredictable, but fact is, he ran for mayor of New York City last year for the Tax Wall Street Party. He was first a Democrat until the Democratic primary, then switched over to the Tax Wall Street Party, and at least planted the flag of the Tax Wall Street Party and the idea of a Wall Street sales tax. So right in the belly of the beast, and he's still there, right? Governor Cuomo the younger of New York, is of course a nepotist. He is a very vicious servant of the Wall Street interests, and up to now he has no opposition in the Democratic primary. So Credico, I think this is Credico 2014. Just look up Randy Credico, CREDICO.org, I think, but Credico2014.org. And there you see he's in the process of gathering signatures, and you'll see all the ways you can relate to that. So between New York and the Northeast and Nebraska and the Midwest, this is the tax. Well, Credico is the former Tax Wall Street. Right now he's in the Democratic primary, and we'll see what happens after that. But the general thrust is the program of the Tax Wall Street Party.
On this line, Webster, Ellen Brown is running for the treasurer of the state of California, I think tomorrow in a primary out there. How about that? And she's all in favor of a state bank and Citibank.
The petty bourgeois opposition, right? There's no note of class struggle. I once asked her, why don't you, if you want to have credit, why don't you tackle the Federal Reserve, right? Take on the Federal Reserve. And she told me, that's impossible. We're too weak. We'll never succeed in moving or touching the Federal Reserve because they're just too strong. So therefore, we play with these toy banks, right? These state banks, which add up really to nothing. For a long time, they were trying to push North Dakota as the paradise on earth because it had North Dakota had a state bank. The problem with that was that for quite a couple of decades, North Dakota had a declining population, which is not a symptom of economic growth in any way, shape, or form. And now, of course, you've got this Bakken shale, sort of backward, old-fashioned energy technology going on. So there are some boom towns there. I would say that I would recommend people, if you want to vote for her, that's fine. But the idea that state banks would
that's not the point. Who do you feel, therefore, is better than her for treasurer of the state of California, if not her? Who's better?
No, it's not her. But again, I urge you, if you're going to have a candidacy like that, you might as well do it for a real fighting class-based program rather than a petty bourgeois chimera like state banks, because they will not do it. If you do what I say, in the aftermath of that, there would become then a possibility of having state banks. But unless you target the Federal Reserve, and I think your listeners can probably understand this, you've got to target the Federal Reserve, break their power, go at them, right? Don't dodge that irrepressible conflict. Once the Federal Reserve has been nationalized or deprivatized, then all sorts of things become possible, among them state banks. But if you try to do it with the state bank first, it's a failure. And I think she ought to tell people what she once told me, right? That she's not going to attack the Federal Reserve because she thinks it's impossible. All
right, cart before the horse. That's all the time. Webster Tarpley will be back on Tuesday night. Tarpley.net. Go there, and it's great.